In 1952, radar operators at Washington National Airport, working alongside military air defense controllers, tracked unidentified objects moving directly over the White House and the Capitol building itself at speeds no aircraft of the era could match, close enough to the literal seat of American government that the Air Force scrambled fighter jets twice in a single week. That specific case file is real, fully declassified, and sitting today in the National Archives alongside more than 12,000 others, all of them collected across 2 decades by the U.S. Air Force's own official UFO investigation program, a program that ran for 22 years, examined everything from swamp gas to genuine radar anomalies, and closed in 1969, having formally left, in its own final tally, 701 cases unexplained. Tonight, we're moving slowly through 300 of these declassified files, congressional hearings, and Pentagon reports, the real, patiently documented history of how governments around the world have investigated objects in their own skies they could not immediately identify. Some of what you'll hear tonight was resolved decades ago as balloons, flares, aircraft, or simple, honest misidentification. Some remains by the government's own official and repeatedly reaffirmed language, genuinely unexplained. We'll tell you clearly which is which as we go. Let the quiet weight of all that paperwork settle over you now, slowly, page by page, file by file, all the way to sleep. Before working through any individual case tonight, it's worth establishing clearly what we actually mean by declassified, since the word gets used loosely in popular UFO discussion in ways that can blur several genuinely different categories of information together. A declassified document is one that was, at some point, formally marked as classified by a government agency, restricting its distribution, and that has since been through a specific bureaucratic review process, resulting in that classification being lifted, making the document legally available to the public, typically through an agency's public reading room, a Freedom of Information Act request, or a scheduled bulk release tied to a specific records retention policy. This is a meaningfully different category from a leaked document which escapes classification without formal authorization, and from an anonymous claim or whistleblower allegation which may reference classified material without any document ever actually being released for public, independent verification at all. Tonight's video focuses specifically on the first category, actual declassified files, while clearly flagging the handful of cases where we're instead discussing testimony, allegations, or claims that remain officially unverified. The United States government's formal involvement in investigating unidentified aerial phenomena began within weeks of the modern UFO era's traditional starting point. On June 24, 1947, Private pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 unusual objects flying in formation near Mount Rainier in Washington state, describing their motion to a reporter in terms that led to the popular press coining the phrase flying saucer, even though Arnold himself had actually described the objects' movement, not their shape, as saucer-like, skipping across the sky the way a saucer might skip across water if thrown. Arnold's report, combined with a wave of similar sightings across the country that summer, prompted the U.S. Army Air Forces, which would become the independent U.S. Air Force later that same year, to establish a formal investigative effort, beginning with a program called Project Sign in January 1948, tasked specifically with collecting, cataloging, and attempting to explain reports of unusual aerial objects submitted by military personnel and, increasingly, members of the public. Project Sign's own internal history offers an early and genuinely instructive illustration of the tension that would define government UFO investigation for the following 2 decades. Some analysts working within Project Sign reportedly drafted an internal document, sometimes referred to in later declassified material as the estimate of the situation, which concluded that at least some reported objects might genuinely represent extraterrestrial spacecraft, a conclusion senior Air Force leadership reportedly rejected as insufficiently supported by evidence, reportedly ordering the document's destruction rather than allowing it to circulate further, though no version of the original document itself has ever been confirmed to have survived for independent verification, meaning its exact contents and even its precise existence rest primarily on second-hand testimony from individuals who worked within the program rather than on a surviving, declassified original. An important distinction we'll return to as a recurring pattern throughout tonight's video. Project Sign was replaced in 1949 by Project Grudge, which took a considerably more skeptical institutional posture toward extraterrestrial explanations specifically, and Grudge was in turn replaced in March 1952 by Project Blue Book, the program that would become, by a wide margin, the most extensive, longest-running, and most thoroughly declassified government UFO investigation in American history. Blue Book operated continuously for the following 17 years under Air Force jurisdiction, staffed at various points by a rotating handful of officers, most famously including astronomer J. Allen Hynek, who served as Blue Book's scientific consultant for its entire run, and who would later become one of the most publicly recognized advocates for taking a small subset of genuinely unresolved cases seriously, after initially approaching the program as a committed skeptic. The full Project Blue Book archive, encompassing case files, internal memoranda, and correspondence generated across its entire run, was formally declassified and transferred to the National Archives following the program's closure in December 1969, and has been available for public researcher access, with certain personal privacy redactions, ever since, decades before the digital scanning projects of the 2010s made the collection dramatically easier to search and browse from home. This complete public availability is worth emphasizing directly, since a persistent popular assumption holds that the government has kept its most significant UFO files locked away indefinitely. The Blue Book Archive's decades-long, essentially unrestricted public availability represents a significant counterexample to that assumption, even, as we'll discuss in later chapters, specific narrower categories of more recent material that genuinely have remained classified for considerably longer, and for which the reasons given by the agencies involved remain at points a subject of legitimate ongoing debate. It's also worth naming directly, before we go further, the framework this video will use throughout to sort fact from speculation, since the subject of tonight's video sits at a genuinely unusual intersection of hard documentary history and persistent, often much less well-supported popular belief. Where a document has been formally declassified and is available for independent verification, we'll describe its contents directly. Where we're discussing testimony, allegations, or claims that reference classified material without an underlying document being available for public confirmation, we'll flag that distinction explicitly using language like according to testimony or an allegation that has not been independently verified, precisely the same careful standard. This channel applies to speculative science and contested history in every other video, and one particularly important to maintain carefully here, given how much genuinely unverified material circulates online attached to real government program names. Before we go further into tonight's specific case files, it's worth pausing to say why a channel like this one exists at all, since a subject this layered deserves the kind of slow, careful telling that works best when there's time to actually sit with the details rather than rush past them. If working slowly through real declassified government files is the kind of thing that helps your mind unwind at the end of the day, subscribing costs nothing, and it's the simplest way to keep this channel making more of these long, unhurried journeys through history's stranger paper trails. Now back to the files, the legal mechanism responsible for the great majority of what has actually been declassified and made publicly available across the entire history of American government UFO investigation is worth naming directly, since it recurs constantly throughout tonight's video. The Freedom of Information Act, signed into law in 1966 and strengthened through several subsequent amendments over the following decades, which grants any member of the public the legal right to formally request specific government records, with an agency generally required either to release the material or to provide a specific, legally defined justification for continued withholding, subject to further appeal. A considerable proportion of the specific files, memos, and reports discussed across tonight's remaining chapters, including several of the most significant individual documents in the entire declassified UFO record, entered public availability specifically because an individual researcher or journalist filed a formal FOIA request, sometimes waiting years and pursuing multiple rounds of appeal before an agency finally released the material in question, a slow, procedurally unglamorous, but genuinely effective legal tool that has done more to bring government UFO records into public view over the past 5 decades than any single act of official voluntary disclosure. The CIA specifically maintains its own dedicated electronic reading room, established following a 1990s executive order requiring agencies to proactively post frequently requested declassified material online, rather than forcing every individual researcher to file a separate request for the same commonly sought files, and the agency's own UFO-related document collection within that reading room, encompassing several thousand pages spanning material connected to Blue Book-era analysis, the Robertson panel discussed in the next chapter, and later Cold War-era assessments remains, according to the CIA's own public statements about its most frequently accessed online holdings, consistently among the reading room's most heavily visited individual subject categories, a genuinely striking fact about sustained public interest in this specific topic relative to the reading room's many other declassified subject areas, spanning everything from Cold War covert operations to nuclear weapons policy, that a UFO-specific collection would rank consistently among the very most visited, because the case that, more than any other, shaped the entire modern UFO phenomenon in American popular culture happened just weeks before Project Sign was even formally established, on a ranch outside a small town in New Mexico. In early July 1947, ranch foreman W.W. Mac Brazel discovered unusual debris scattered across a section of ranch land roughly 75 miles northwest of Roswell, New Mexico, material he described as including rubber strips, tinfoil, tough paper, and thin wooden sticks, unlike anything he recognized from ordinary ranch operations. Brazel reported the debris to the local sheriff, who in turn contacted the Roswell Army Airfield, and on July 8, 1947, the base's public information officer, acting under instructions from Base Commander Colonel William Blanchard, issued a press release stating that personnel from the 509th Bomb Group had recovered a flying disc, a statement that generated brief but genuinely significant national newspaper coverage before being retracted within 24 hours, replaced by a revised official explanation identifying the debris as the remains of a conventional weather balloon, complete with a staged press photograph showing recovered material laid out on a floor that, to many later researchers examining the photograph, appeared consistent with an ordinary radar reflector and balloon assembly rather than anything more exotic. For roughly 3 decades following 1947, the Roswell incident remained a relatively minor, largely forgotten footnote, even within UFO research circles, generating comparatively little sustained public attention until the case was revived by a new wave of investigative books and articles beginning in the late 1970s, drawing on interviews with surviving witnesses conducted decades after the original event, interviews that introduced considerably more elaborate claims than the original 1947 press coverage had ever included, among them assertions of multiple crash sites, recovered alien bodies, and a large-scale military cover-up extending to the highest levels of government. It's important to note directly that these more elaborate later claims rest primarily on witness testimony gathered decades after the fact, a category of historical evidence researchers generally treat with meaningfully more caution than a contemporaneous document, given the well-documented ways human memory can shift, blend with subsequent media coverage, and become less reliable over long stretches of time, particularly regarding a single, brief, decades-old event. The U.S. Air Force conducted 2 formal, dedicated investigations into the Roswell case, specifically in response to the renewed public and congressional interest generated by these later claims, and both resulting reports have been fully declassified and are publicly available. The first, released in 1994, entitled The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, concluded that the recovered debris almost certainly originated from Project Mogul, a highly classified program active in 1947 that used high-altitude balloon trains fitted with sensitive acoustic sensors specifically designed to detect Soviet nuclear weapons tests from a distance, a program whose specific technical details remained classified for years after 1947, which the report argued explained why base personnel in 1947 might genuinely not have immediately recognized the unusual debris and might have been instructed, given the program's sensitive nature, to publicly attribute it to something more mundane once the classified nature of the actual balloon equipment became clear to officers further up the chain of command. The Second Air Force report, released in 1997, entitled The Roswell Report, Case Closed, addressed the specific claims of recovered alien bodies that had become central to the case's later popular retelling, concluding that these accounts most likely stemmed from a conflation of several genuinely distinct and independently documented events across the following decade, including the U.S. Air Force's use of anthropomorphic test dummies during high-altitude parachute experiments conducted in the 1950s, a period considerably later than 1947, along with several unrelated military aircraft accidents involving fatalities during the same general era, that later interview subjects, recalling events from an increasingly distant and jumbled personal timeline, decades afterward, may have genuinely and sincerely, if inaccurately, blended together into a single composite memory pointing back toward 1947. One specific witness whose account played an outsized role in shaping the case's later, more elaborate popular mythology illustrates this pattern especially clearly, and is worth examining directly as a case study in careful source evaluation. Glenn Dennis, a Roswell mortician in 1947, gave detailed interviews decades later describing being contacted by base personnel about small caskets and later encountering an Army nurse who described participating in the examination of small, unusual bodies, an account that became one of the central pillars supporting the recovered alien bodies narrative once it entered wide circulation through the late 1980s and 1990s, when the Air Force's 1997 investigative team attempted to independently verify Dennis's account. They were unable to locate any nurse matching his description among the full roster of nursing personnel who had actually served at Roswell Army Airfield during the relevant period, and Dennis himself was unable to provide the woman's name, having stated in various interviews that he had either forgotten it or that she had died shortly afterward in circumstances he described inconsistently across different retellings. The Dennis account remains, among researchers who have most carefully cross-checked it against the surviving base personnel records, one of the most specifically and thoroughly disputed individual testimonies connected to the entire Roswell case, a useful direct illustration of exactly why this video has applied additional caution throughout, to testimony gathered decades after the fact, compared to the weight given to genuinely contemporaneous documentation. Not every element of the government's shifting public explanation across 1947, 1994, and 1997 has fully satisfied every researcher who has examined the case closely, and it's worth acknowledging that criticism honestly, rather than presenting the Air Force's later reports as having definitively closed every question the case has ever raised. Some independent researchers have pointed to specific inconsistencies between witness accounts and the timeline the mogul balloon explanation requires, and have argued the government's own shifting explanations across 5 decades, weather balloon in 1947, then Project Mogul in 1994, understandably fuel continued public skepticism regarding whether the full picture has actually been provided, even among researchers who don't personally credit the more extreme extraterrestrial claims associated with the case's later popular retelling. Roswell's expanded later mythology also became directly entangled, beginning in 1984 with a separate and considerably more thoroughly discredited body of material worth addressing directly here, since it illustrates precisely the kind of document authenticity question this video has committed to examining carefully throughout. That year, a set of documents surfaced purporting to be briefing papers for a top-secret group called Majestic 12, allegedly established by President Truman specifically to manage the recovery and study of crashed extraterrestrial craft, beginning with Roswell itself. The FBI formally investigated the document's origin and authenticity in the early 1990s, and independent document examiners, along with several archivists at the National Archives itself, identified multiple, specific and serious problems with the papers, including a Truman signature that appeared to have been copied directly from an entirely unrelated, genuine 1947 document, typewriter fonts inconsistent with equipment, actually in government use during the paper's claimed date, and formatting inconsistent with standard national security document conventions of the period. The consensus among professional document examiners, mainstream historians, and the majority of serious UFO researchers themselves is that the Majestic 12 papers are a modern forgery, and their thorough, well-documented debunking stands as a useful and instructive companion piece to the genuinely declassified mogul-related material discussed above, illustrating clearly the real, meaningful difference between an authenticated government document and a compelling-looking fabrication circulating under a classified-sounding name. What can be stated with genuine confidence, based on the fully declassified documentary record now available, is this: Project Mogul was real, was genuinely classified in 1947, and did conduct balloon-based sensor flights in the general vicinity of Roswell during exactly the relevant window, facts confirmed through multiple independent government and non-government historical sources well beyond the Air Force's own later self-investigation. Whatever combination of factors ultimately explains every specific witness account connected to the Roswell case, the event's true lasting significance may lie less in what specifically crashed on that New Mexico ranch in July 1947, and more in how a relatively minor, quickly retracted local news story from the earliest days of the Cold War went on to become the single most culturally significant UFO case in American history. Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who personally traveled to the Brazel Ranch in 1947 to collect the debris and who appears by name in the original wire service photographs taken at the time, became, decades later, one of the central figures whose retrospective interviews helped drive the case's revival, granting his first detailed public interview on the subject in 1978, more than 30 years after the original event, in which he described the recovered material in terms considerably more exotic than his own. Contemporaneous 1947 statements to the press had used, specifically stating in the later interview that he personally believed the material was not of this earth. Marcel's shifting account across 3 decades, a genuinely real and well-documented discrepancy between his own 1947 public statements, in which he readily identified the material as a balloon and radar target once instructed to do so, and his later, considerably more dramatic 1978 recollection is frequently cited by researchers on both sides of the case's ongoing evidentiary debate. Skeptics point to it as a clear illustration of memory drift and embellishment over decades, precisely the pattern this video has flagged repeatedly tonight, while researchers more sympathetic to the extraterrestrial hypothesis have instead argued Marcel's later account represents him finally speaking freely once he felt safe from the career consequences that might have followed an open contradiction of official 1947 Air Force messaging. The town of Roswell itself has in the decades since built a substantial local economy around the case's enduring fame, home to the privately operated International UFO Museum and Research Center, established in 1991 and now drawing several 100,000 visitors annually. According to the museum's own published figures, along with an annual UFO festival each July that has become one of the town's most significant tourism draws. It's a genuinely notable, if somewhat wry, footnote to close this chapter on. A hastily retracted 1947 press release describing a classified balloon program, misidentified for 24 hours as a flying disc before base officials corrected the record, has generated more sustained economic and cultural activity in the 8 decades since than nearly any other single event in the town's broader history, regardless of which specific explanation any individual visitor ultimately finds most persuasive, reshaping public expectation for every government UFO investigation that followed it, including the very next major case in our timeline, one that occurred just 5 years later, considerably closer to the center of American political power. Over 2 separate weekends in July 1952, radar operators and pilots across the greater Washington, D.C. area reported and tracked unidentified aerial objects moving through some of the most closely monitored airspace in the entire country, a case that, unlike Roswell, generated substantial contemporaneous documentation, extensive same-week newspaper coverage, and a level of institutional concerns serious enough to prompt a formal Pentagon press conference, at the time the largest press conference the Pentagon had held since the end of the Second World War. The first wave of sightings began late on the night of July 19, 1952, when air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport detected unidentified objects on radar moving at speeds, their equipment estimated in excess of 100 miles per hour, tracked simultaneously by a second, independent radar installation at nearby Andrews Air Force Base, ruling out a single equipment malfunction as the sole explanation. Airline pilots flying through the region that same night independently reported visual sightings of unusual lights matching the radar contacts' reported positions, and Air Force fighter jets were scrambled to intercept, though by the time the jets arrived on scene, the objects had reportedly already left the area, a pattern that repeated itself when a nearly identical wave of radar and visual sightings recurred the following weekend on the night of July 26, prompting a second, considerably faster fighter scramble that this time did achieve brief visual contact, according to pilot reports filed immediately afterward and preserved within the Project Blue Book case files. Harry Barnes, the senior air traffic controller on duty at Washington National Airport during the first wave of sightings, gave a detailed account to the press within days of the event that has remained one of the most frequently cited primary testimonies connected to the entire case, describing the radar returns he personally observed as behaving in ways fully consistent with solid physical objects rather than any weather artifact he was familiar with from his own extensive professional radar experience, and stating specifically that he did not believe the temperature inversion explanation adequately accounted for what his team had tracked that night, a direct named, professionally credentialed dissent from the government's own eventual official position, delivered by the specific individual, whose job it was to interpret exactly this kind of radar data under ordinary, non-UFO-related circumstances every working day. The Air Force's official explanation, presented at the July 29, 1952, by Major General John Samford, the Air Force's Director of Intelligence, attributed the radar returns primarily to a weather phenomenon called a temperature inversion, a specific atmospheric condition in which a layer of warm air sits above a layer of cooler air near the surface, which can bend radio waves in ways that cause ground-based radar to detect false returns, effectively seeing objects that are actually distant ground clutter or ordinary aircraft whose signal has been bent and misrepresented on the radar display. Samford's press conference explanation is preserved, along with the underlying Blue Book case documentation, in the fully declassified Project Blue Book archive, and it remains to this day the official government position on the case. The temperature inversion explanation has faced genuine, sustained scientific criticism from several directions over the decades since, criticism worth representing fairly here, rather than treating the 1952 press conference as having settled every technical question the case raised. Some meteorologists and radar specialists who have re-examined the case in subsequent decades have questioned whether the specific atmospheric conditions recorded in the Washington, D.C. area on those particular July nights were actually strong enough to produce the kind of persistent, structured, and apparently maneuvering radar returns that controllers described at the time, and have noted that temperature inversion explanations struggle considerably more to account for the independent visual sightings reported by pilots and ground observers on the same nights, since an inversion layer radar artifact would not, on its own, explain someone looking up and seeing an unusual light with their own eyes matching the radar's reported position and movement. What makes the 1952 Washington Flyovers genuinely significant within the broader history of government UFO investigation, regardless of how one ultimately weighs the competing technical explanations, is the sheer institutional seriousness with which the case was treated at the time, a seriousness reflected directly in the extensive, multiply-sourced, largely contemporaneous documentation the event generated, including radar logs from 2 separate installations, multiple independent pilot debriefing reports, and a formal, on-the-record Pentagon press conference, a combination of same-week documentation from several independent sources, considerably richer than what exists. For most cases discussed tonight, Roswell very much included, precisely because of how quickly and publicly the government responded to a case unfolding directly over its own capital. The Washington Flyovers also mark a meaningful turning point in how the still-young Project Blue Book approached its work going forward. Internal Air Force correspondence from the weeks immediately following the case, later declassified along with the rest of the Blue Book archive, reveals genuine concern among senior officers that repeated unexplained radar and visual contacts over the nation's capital, if left without any public explanation at all, risked generating exactly the kind of public panic the Air Force had specifically hoped to avoid since the program's earliest days, a concern that directly shaped the Robertson Panel, a scientific advisory committee convened by the CIA later that same year specifically to review Blue Book's overall methodology and recommend how the government should manage public UFO reporting. Going forward, a panel whose own declassified findings would go on to shape Air Force UFO policy for the remainder of Blue Book's 17-year operational history. The Robertson Panel, chaired by physicist H.P. Robertson and convened over 4 days in January 1953, reviewed a representative sample of Blue Book's strongest cases, including material connected to the Washington Flyovers, and its final report, formally declassified decades later, reached two conclusions that would shape American government UFO policy for years afterward. First, the panel concluded that the reviewed cases posed no evidence of direct threat to national security. Second, and considerably more consequentially for how the public would come to understand government UFO policy, the panel specifically recommended that the Air Force undertake a coordinated public education and debunking campaign, its own declassified report's actual word choice, aimed at reducing public interest in and reporting of UFO sightings, reasoning that the sheer volume of public reports, whatever their individual merit, risked overwhelming genuine national security monitoring channels during an already tense early Cold War period. This recommendation, once its existence became publicly known through later declassification, became one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for researchers who have argued that Blue Book's later operational years, particularly following the CIA-directed policy shift the Robertson panel initiated, prioritized public reassurance over genuinely open scientific investigation, a criticism the panel's own declassified language does little to directly refute. Across its full 17-year operational run, from 1952 to 1969, Project Blue Book formally investigated a total of 12,618 individual reports of unidentified flying objects, a figure drawn directly from the program's own final summary statistics, preserved in the fully declassified archive now held by the National Archives. Of that total, the Air Force's own official final tally classified 11,917 reports, roughly 94%, as explained through conventional means including misidentified aircraft, weather balloons, astronomical objects such as bright planets or meteors, and a considerable number of outright hoaxes, leaving 701 cases, a bit under 6% of the total, formally and permanently classified by the program's own internal standards as unidentified, meaning investigators were unable to determine a conventional explanation using the information available to them at the time, a formal classification worth understanding precisely, since unidentified in Blue Book's own official usage never meant confirmed extraterrestrial, only that a conventional explanation could not be established with the evidence on hand. This overall statistical picture rests on more than Blue Book's own internal record-keeping alone. In 1955, the Air Force separately commissioned the Battelle Memorial Institute, an independent scientific research organization, to conduct a rigorous statistical analysis of the roughly 3,200 Blue Book cases collected up to that point, an effort that produced Special Report Number 14, a document that applied formal statistical methodology, sorting cases by the quality and completeness of the underlying report, and cross-tabulating that quality rating against whether a case was ultimately explained, a genuinely more sophisticated analytical approach than Blue Book's own internal case-by-case review typically applied. The Battelle analysis found a specific and, to some researchers, genuinely counterintuitive pattern. Reports rated as the highest quality, meaning those submitted by the most experienced, most credible observers with the most detailed and internally consistent descriptions, were, if anything, somewhat less likely to receive a conventional explanation than lower quality reports. A statistical finding the report's own authors described as suggestive rather than conclusive, but one that has been cited repeatedly by researchers arguing that Blue Book's overall unresolved caseload cannot simply be dismissed as a predictable byproduct of poor quality or unreliable witness reporting. Among the specific case files within this unresolved category, the Levelland, Texas incident of November 2 and 3, 1957, stands out for the sheer volume and consistency of independent witness reports it generated within a remarkably short window of time. Over the course of roughly one night, at least 15 separate individuals across the small Texas town and surrounding countryside independently reported encountering a large glowing egg-shaped object at close range, with several witnesses driving separate vehicles at different times and locations across the same few hours, specifically reporting that their car engines and headlights failed completely as they approached the object, only to restart normally once the object had departed. Local sheriff's deputies who responded to several of these reports directly and who filed their own official reports describing similar observations gave the case an unusually strong law enforcement documentary foundation compared to many other Blue Book files, and the Air Force's own investigation, while ultimately attributing the case to ball lightning, or an atmospheric electrical phenomenon associated with the severe thunderstorm activity documented in the region that same night, acknowledged in its own internal case file that the specific combination of consistent vehicle electrical failures reported by multiple independent witnesses across separate encounters was not fully and satisfactorily explained by that proposed mechanism alone. One of the earliest cases to establish the pattern of credible pilot testimony that would recur throughout the following 7 decades of declassified files occurred on July 24, 1948, when Eastern Airlines pilots Clarence Childs and John Whitted reported a close encounter with a large, cigar-shaped, wingless object trailing a bright orange glow, passing directly alongside their DC-3 airliner near Montgomery, Alabama, at an altitude and proximity close enough that both pilots reported feeling turbulence from the object's wake as it passed. A passenger aboard the flight independently reported seeing a similar bright light, though notably did not describe the object's structural details in the same specific terms the two pilots did, and the case, investigated by the Air Force's earliest formal program, Project Sign, discussed at the start of tonight's video, became one of the specific incidents cited within the internal estimate of the situation document, the one reportedly ordered destroyed by senior Air Force leadership. That concluded, some reports might genuinely represent extraterrestrial craft, a direct, specific documentary thread connecting one of the earliest Blue Book-era pilot cases to one of tonight's opening chapter's most significant, if only second-hand documented, institutional episodes. Project Sign's own formally declassified final report, published in early 1949 under the title Unidentified Aerial Objects. Project Sign ultimately reached a considerably more cautious official conclusion than the disputed internal estimate, stating that while some cases remained genuinely unexplained using available evidence, the report's authors did not consider the data sufficient to either confirm or rule out any specific hypothesis regarding the object's origin, a formally measured, deliberately non-committal institutional posture that would go on to characterize nearly every subsequent official American government statement on the subject across the following 7.5 decades, right up through AARO's own carefully worded 2024 conclusions discussed later in tonight's video. The Lonnie Zamora incident, which occurred near Socorro, New Mexico on April 20, 1964, holds particular significance within the Blue Book archive because the primary witness was an on-duty police officer with a well-documented, previously unblemished record for careful and credible reporting, a factor Blue Book investigators, including J. Allen Hynek personally, treated as considerably strengthening the case's overall credibility compared to many other reports the program received. Officer Zamora reported observing a white, egg-shaped object resting on legs in a ravine outside town, accompanied by 2 smaller figures in white coveralls near its base, before the object took off with a roar and a burst of flame, leaving physical traces at the site, including burn marks and depressions in the soil, that Air Force investigators personally examined and documented within days of the event. Zamora's case remains one of the relatively small number of Blue Book files that Hynek himself, writing years later after leaving the program and growing considerably more publicly skeptical of the Air Force's overall investigative rigor, continued to cite specifically as a case he personally regarded as genuinely unexplained rather than simply unresolved due to insufficient investigative effort. It's worth being direct about the honest limitations of Blue Book's overall investigative methodology, limitations later official reviews, and even some Blue Book personnel themselves acknowledged candidly within the declassified record. The program operated for most of its existence with a remarkably small permanent staff, at various points as few as 1 or 2 officers, handling the full national caseload alongside their other military duties, and investigators frequently lacked the time, specialized scientific equipment, or subject matter expertise needed to conduct the kind of rigorous, immediate, on-scene investigation that a case like Zamora's, or many others in the 701-case unresolved category, would have genuinely required to reach a fully confident conventional explanation, a structural limitation that later reviewers, including some connected to the Condon report, discussed in the next chapter, specifically identified as a meaningful, contributing factor behind the size of the program's unresolved case backlog. Blue Book's declassified files also document a considerable number of cases the program itself formally and explicitly identified as hoaxes, a category worth including directly here for balance, since it's an important part of the program's real documentary record that popular retellings sometimes leave out. These ranged from deliberately staged photographs using suspended models or lens artifacts, several of which were later confirmed as hoaxes by the individuals responsible themselves in later interviews or confessions, to reports later traced directly to conventional secret military aircraft testing, a category that has taken on additional significance in recent decades as programs including the U-2 spy plane and later stealth aircraft development, both genuinely classified at the time of many Blue Book-era sightings, have themselves been declassified, allowing later researchers to retroactively match a meaningful number of Cold War-era UFO reports to specific, now declassified American aircraft test flights that observers on the ground had no way of correctly identifying at the time, since the aircraft's very existence remained a closely guarded state secret. By the middle years of the 1960s, Project Blue Book faced mounting institutional pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Continued public and congressional interest in a steady stream of new reports, growing academic and scientific criticism of the program's investigative rigor, and its close institutional ties to an Air Force that many outside critics believed had a built-in incentive to minimize and dismiss cases rather than investigate them with genuine open-mindedness, and, increasingly, internal friction between the program's remaining staff and its own longtime scientific consultant, J. Allen Hynek, who had grown steadily more vocal in his public criticism of the program's methodology, even while continuing to formally serve as its consultant. One lasting contribution J. Allen Hynek made during his years as Blue Book's scientific consultant, developed specifically to bring a more rigorous and consistent analytical framework to the program's sprawling and inconsistently documented caseload, was a formal classification system sorting reports by the nature and closeness of the reported observation, distinguishing nocturnal lights, daylight disks, and radar visual cases among distant sightings, and separately categorizing what he termed close encounters, observations occurring within roughly 500 feet of the witness, into 3 further tiers: a close encounter of the first kind, involving a close sighting with no interaction or physical trace; a close encounter of the second kind, involving a close sighting that left some physical evidence, such as the burn marks and depressions Air Force investigators documented at the Zamora case's landing site; and a close encounter of the third kind, involving the reported presence of animate beings. Hynek's terminology, introduced through his own published academic writing during and after his Blue Book years, later became famous well beyond scientific circles, specifically because director Steven Spielberg borrowed the third-tier phrase directly as the title of his 1977 film, a rare and genuinely direct link between a formal government program's own internal analytical classification system and a piece of major mainstream popular culture, with Hynek himself even making a brief on-screen cameo appearance in the film he had unintentionally helped name. This mounting pressure from inside the program and out would culminate in a formal independent scientific review that would ultimately determine the program's fate entirely. By 1966, facing sustained congressional and public pressure to demonstrate genuine, credible scientific rigor, rather than continuing to rely solely on its own internal military investigators, the U.S. Air Force contracted with the University of Colorado to conduct an independent scientific review of the UFO phenomenon, formally led by physicist Edward Condon, a prominent and well-respected figure within American physics who had previously directed the National Bureau of Standards. The resulting study, formally titled Scientific Study of Unidentified Flying Objects, but almost universally known simply as the Condon Report, was published in January 1969 after roughly 2.5 years of research, and its conclusions would directly and immediately lead to Project Blue Book's closure later that same year. The Condon Report's central conclusion, stated plainly in its opening summary, held that further extensive scientific study of UFO reports was unlikely to yield significant new scientific knowledge, and it explicitly recommended that the Air Force discontinue Project Blue Book as a dedicated government investigative program. This headline conclusion generated immediate and considerable controversy that has, if anything, only grown more pronounced among researchers examining the report's full internal record in the decades since. For a specific and well-documented reason, a close reading of the report's own detailed case-by-case appendices reveals that Condon's investigative team itself was unable to find conventional explanations for a meaningful number it personally examined in depth, including several cases its own investigators described, in the report's own internal technical language, as involving genuinely unusual and unexplained radar and visual data, a striking and widely noted internal tension between the report's skeptical summary conclusions and its own more cautious detailed case findings. This tension became considerably more publicly consequential in early 1968, roughly a year before the report's official publication, when a memo written by Robert Lowe, the University of Colorado administrator overseeing the project's day-to-day management, was leaked to and published by a UFO research organization. The Lowe memo, written in 1966 before the study had formally begun, described the planned project in terms that many critics, once the memo became public, interpreted as indicating the study's conclusions had effectively been predetermined from the outset, with Lowe reportedly writing that the resulting study, designed as we now anticipate it, would probably not find evidence supporting the existence of UFOs, phrasing that led two of the project's own scientific team members, astronomer and researcher David Saunders, along with fellow researcher Norman Levine, to be dismissed from the project after they raised concerns internally about the memo's implications for the study's scientific objectivity, a dismissal that generated its own separate wave of public controversy and congressional attention well before the final report was even published. Despite this genuine methodological controversy, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, one of the country's most prominent general scientific bodies, formally reviewed and endorsed the Condon Report's overall scientific conclusions shortly after its publication, lending the report considerable institutional credibility within mainstream American science even as UFO researchers, and, notably, some of the report's own contributing scientists continued to raise pointed questions about how fairly the study's specific detailed findings had ultimately been represented in its public summary conclusions, a genuine and largely unresolved tension between the report's institutional reception and its own internal documented record that continues to be debated by historians of science, examining the full declassified paper trail today. David Saunders, one of the two researchers dismissed from the Colorado project following the Lowe memo controversy, published his own detailed account of the study's internal workings in a 1968 book written before the official report's publication and titled UFOs. Yes, offering a considerably more critical insider perspective on the project's methodology and internal culture than the eventual official report itself would present. And Saunders' account remains among historians of the Condon study. Specifically, one of the most frequently cited primary sources for understanding the genuine internal tension between the project's working scientists and its administrative leadership during the roughly 2.5 years the study was conducted. A separate, somewhat less publicly prominent review, conducted independently by a working group within the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics and published in 1970, examined a sample of UFO cases using its own membership of practicing aerospace engineers and scientists, and reached a notably more measured conclusion than Condon's own summary language, finding that roughly 30% of the specific cases it examined in detail could not be explained through any conventional means the group's own technically expert membership could identify, a considerably higher unresolved percentage than Blue Book's own overall historical average, and one occasionally cited by researchers as evidence that a technically expert review panel examining the same broad category of evidence Condon's own team had access to could reach a meaningfully different conclusion regarding how much of the phenomenon remained genuinely unexplained. James McDonald, a senior atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona with an established, well-regarded record in mainstream meteorological research entirely separate from the UFO subject, emerged as one of the Condon report's most persistent and most academically credentialed critics following its publication, conducting his own independent field investigations of numerous individual cases and testifying before Congress in 1968, prior to the report's release, that he considered the existing government investigative effort scientifically inadequate to the genuine complexity several specific cases presented. McDonald's criticism carried particular institutional weight precisely because he approached the subject from within mainstream atmospheric physics rather than from any prior UFO research background, and his death by suicide in 1971, following a period of documented depression connected to unrelated personal and health difficulties, is sometimes cited by later researchers examining his career, though it's worth stating plainly that no formally declassified document has ever established any connection between his death and his UFO research specifically, a distinction worth maintaining precisely given how easily such claims can drift into unsupported speculation once a public figure's death becomes entangled with a subject as prone to conspiracy theorizing as this one. Whatever the report's ultimate scientific merits, its practical institutional consequence arrived quickly and decisively. The U.S. Air Force formally announced the closure of Project Blue Book on December 17, 1969, citing the Condon Report's recommendations directly as its primary justification, bringing to an end 22 years of continuous, formally organized American government UFO investigation, dating back to Project Sign's establishment in 1948, a closure the Air Force's own announcement framed explicitly as reflecting a considered judgment that continued study was not scientifically justified by the available evidence, language drawn nearly verbatim from the Condon Report's own central conclusion. Blue Book's closure did not, contrary to a persistent popular assumption, mark the complete and permanent end of American government interest in the subject, a claim tonight's later chapters, covering the modern Pentagon UAP programs established decades afterward, will directly complicate. What it did mark, definitively and by the Air Force's own explicit statement at the time, was the end of the specific, continuous, dedicated public-facing investigative apparatus that had operated openly under that name since 1952, leaving a genuine institutional gap of more than 4 decades before the U.S. government would again establish a comparably formal, dedicated program specifically tasked with investigating unidentified aerial phenomena, a gap during which individual, isolated cases, including several genuinely striking ones from outside the United States, entirely continued to generate their own separate and separately declassified documentary trails. Over several nights in late December 1980, United States Air Force personnel stationed at RF Woodbridge in Suffolk, England, a base then operated jointly with the neighboring RAF Bentwaters as part of a NATO air defense arrangement during the Cold War, reported encountering unusual lights and, according to several witnesses' contemporaneous and later accounts, a physical object within the adjacent Rendlesham forest, generating what remains, more than 4 decades later, the most extensively documented and most thoroughly declassified UFO case ever associated with United States military personnel stationed on foreign soil. The case's most significant piece of contemporaneous documentation is a memorandum written on January 13, 1981, by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander who personally led a follow-up investigation into the forest on the second night of reported activity, a document now universally known among researchers as the Halt Memo, addressed to the British Ministry of Defense and formally declassified decades ago. The memo describes Halt's team observing a metallic, triangular object with a bright light on top, maneuvering through the forest and emitting beams of light down toward the ground, along with subsequent observations of lights moving erratically in the night sky above the base over the following hours, described in the memo's own careful, methodical military language as exhibiting movement inconsistent with any conventional aircraft the observing officers were able to identify at the time. The memo also documents that Halt's team, returning to the site the following day in daylight, measured elevated radiation readings at the specific location where witnesses had reported the object resting, using a handheld Geiger counter, along with 3 small ground depressions arranged in a triangular pattern and consistent with landing gear-style indentations. Physical evidence, subsequently photographed and formally documented within the base's own official incident file, providing the case with a category of physical instrument-measured evidence that few other cases discussed across tonight's video, Zamora's New Mexico encounter being a notable earlier exception, can similarly claim. Halt's own account gained considerable additional documentary weight when an audio recording he made in real time during the second night's investigation, using a handheld tape recorder as his team moved through the forest, became publicly available in later years, providing researchers with a genuinely rare contemporaneous audio record of a UFO investigation as it actually unfolded, rather than relying solely on a written report compiled afterward from memory. On the recording, Halt and his team can be heard describing and reacting to unusual lights in real time, using language that, while excited and clearly describing something the officers found genuinely puzzling in the moment, stops well short of any explicit claim regarding the object's ultimate origin or nature. A separate and considerably more elaborate account comes from Sergeant Jim Peniston, one of the security patrolmen who, along with Airman John Burroughs, was among the first personnel to encounter the object directly on the first night, before Halt's own team arrived on the second. Peniston has stated in interviews given decades after the event that he personally approached and physically touched the object, and that he later recovered a small notebook, reportedly containing handwritten notes and symbols. He stated he had copied directly from markings visible on the object's surface that night, a notebook Peniston did not make public until 2010, nearly 30 years after the events themselves. Peniston's notebook and his broader, considerably more detailed later account including claims of downloading binary code directly through physical contact with the object, a specific claim that goes well beyond anything recorded in Halt's own contemporaneous memo or audio recording, has drawn genuine skepticism even from some researchers who otherwise consider the core Rendlesham case credible, given the 3-decade gap between the original event and the notebook's public unveiling, a gap this video has flagged as a meaningful source of caution throughout, and one that applies with particular force to Peniston's most elaborate specific claims, as distinct from the more restrained, closely time-stamped documentation Halt's own memo and recording provide. Several proposed conventional explanations for the Rendlesham events have been offered by different investigators over the decades since, none of which has achieved the kind of broad consensus acceptance that, for instance, the mogul balloon explanation eventually achieved for Roswell. These proposed explanations include the nearby Orfordness Lighthouse, whose rotating beam some skeptical researchers have argued could have been misidentified by observers moving through dense, disorienting forest terrain at night, a bright meteor fireball independently reported over the region around the same general time period by other observers unconnected to the base, and, more speculatively, a possible connection to a classified military exercise or equipment test, a theory that has never been confirmed through any declassified document specifically connecting such an exercise to the base during the exact nights in question, and that remains, like several competing explanations in this specific case, genuinely unresolved. Colonel Halt himself, notably, has continued to maintain in interviews and public statements given across the following 4 decades, including formal statements made well into his retirement from military service, that he personally does not believe the lighthouse explanation adequately accounts for what he and his directly observed and documented at close range during the second night's investigation, specifically a position from a senior, directly involved military officer with a documented, contemporaneous written and audio record that gives his continued skepticism toward the conventional explanations considerably more evidentiary weight than an equivalent claim made by someone without Halt's direct, on-scene, formally documented involvement in the case. The British Ministry of Defence's own file on the Rendlesham incident was formally declassified and released to the public in 2001, following a Freedom of Information request campaign, and the released file, consistent with the broader pattern already established across several earlier chapters tonight, reveals an internal government assessment considerably more measured and cautious than either the most dramatic popular retellings of the case or, at the opposite extreme, the most dismissive skeptical accounts might separately suggest, with internal Ministry of Defense correspondence acknowledging as involving credible, professionally trained military witnesses reporting an event they could not adequately explain, while also explicitly declining to reach any formal conclusion regarding the object's ultimate nature or origin, a genuinely open institutional verdict that, more than 4 decades after the events themselves, still stands as the British government's official position on what remains the most significant UFO case in its own declassified historical record. The base itself, jointly operated by the U.S. Air Force and closely tied into NATO's broader Cold War nuclear posture, was at the time reportedly used to store American tactical nuclear weapons under a formal bilateral agreement between the two nations, a detail that has led some researchers to speculate the incident may have involved a sensitive security response connected to that weapon storage role rather than anything genuinely unexplained, a plausible, alternative framing worth naming directly, though no declassified document has ever specifically connected the Rendlesham events to any weapons security incident or exercise, leaving the theory, like several others proposed for this particular case, in the category of informed speculation rather than confirmed explanation. On the night of September 18 and 1976, the Imperial Iranian Air Force scrambled two F-4 Phantom fighter jets from Sharoki Air Force Base near Tehran in response to reports of an unusually bright object maneuvering over the city, generating a case that, once declassified through the American Defense Intelligence Agency's formal reporting channels, would become one of the most technically detailed and most frequently cited military UFO encounters in the entire declassified historical record, distinguished specifically by its combination of extended visual observation, radar contact, and a documented weapons systems failure during a genuine attempted intercept. Declassified State Department and Embassy cable traffic from 1976, released through routine historical archive processes, well after the fact, indicates the September encounter was not entirely isolated, with several other unusual aerial sightings reported across various parts of Iran. During roughly the same general period, a broader regional pattern of increased reporting that some researchers have connected to heightened public and media attention following earlier publicized sightings elsewhere in the world that same year, though it's worth being direct that no comparably detailed or comparably well-corroborated case from this broader Iranian wave approaches the Tehran Incident's own specific combination of radar, visual, and documented instrumentation evidence, meaning the September encounter remains, even within its own immediate regional and temporal context, a genuine evidentiary outlier rather than simply one representative example among many similar reports. The incident occurred within the broader context of the close American-Iranian military relationship of the period, less than 3 years before the Iranian Revolution would sever those ties entirely, meaning the F-4 Phantoms involved, along with the air defense infrastructure that detected and tracked the object, were themselves part of a large American-supplied and American-trained Air Force, a detail that gave the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency direct institutional access to detailed debriefing information through its own established liaison channels with the Iranian military. Considerably closer and more immediate access than the DIA had to comparable foreign military encounters occurring in less closely allied nations during the same general period. The first Iranian F-4, piloted by Lieutenant Parviz Jafari, according to the later declassified U.S. report, closed to within visual range of the object and reported it as an extremely bright pulsing light considerably larger and more intense than any star or conventional aircraft. And as the fighter attempted to close further and achieve a weapons lock in preparation for a potential intercept, Jafari reported that his aircraft's instrumentation, including his radar and weapons systems, along with his radio communications, failed simultaneously and completely, only returning to normal function once he broke off his approach and increased distance from the object, a specific, technically detailed failure pattern that forms the documentary core of the entire case's significance. The full official account of the incident, including detailed technical debriefing information gathered directly from the Iranian pilots involved, was formally documented and transmitted through official channels by the United States Defense Intelligence Agency, and this DIA report was later declassified and made publicly available, providing researchers with a considerably more detailed and technically specific documentary record than exists for most cases discussed tonight, since it includes direct pilot debriefing testimony gathered within days of the event itself, cross-referenced against available ground radar data from Iranian air defense installations that had also independently tracked unusual returns matching the reported encounter's general timeline and location. A second Iranian F-4, scrambled after the first aircraft's systems failure, also reported visual contact with the object, along with a secondary, smaller object that separated from the main object at one point during the extended encounter before reportedly rejoining it later, according to the pilot's contemporaneous account preserved within the declassified DIA report. an additional detail that has drawn particular attention from researchers, since a genuine equipment malfunction or conventional misidentification would not typically be expected to produce a coherent, internally consistent narrative of one object apparently separating into two and later recombining, reported independently by a second flight crew. No fully conventional explanation for the Tehran incident has achieved the kind of broad consensus acceptance among researchers and skeptics alike that explanations for several other cases discussed tonight have achieved, and it's worth being direct about that genuine, persistent gap rather than manufacturing a false sense of resolution the declassified record itself does not actually provide. Proposed conventional explanations have included the bright planet Jupiter, combined with a possible instrumentation malfunction unrelated to the sighting itself, though critics of this explanation have noted it struggles considerably to account for the specific, repeated, and independently reported pattern of avionics, failure occurring specifically as the aircraft closed distance with the object and recovering specifically once distance increased, a correlation that, if accurately reported by the pilots involved, would require a genuinely unusual and currently unexplained physical mechanism to produce through purely conventional means. The Tehran incident's evidentiary significance within the broader declassified UFO record rests specifically on this particular combination of factors: multiple independent trained military observers, a documented and internally consistent avionics failure pattern correlated directly with the aircraft's proximity to the object, corroborating ground radar data, and a fully declassified official U.S. government intelligence report compiling and formally transmitting the entire account through standard defense channels, a combination of independent, corroborating evidence considerably richer than exists for the great majority of the roughly 701 cases. Project Blue Book itself formally left unresolved, and one frequently cited, including by later Pentagon officials involved in the modern UAP programs discussed in upcoming chapters, as among the small handful of historical cases genuinely deserving of continued serious, analytical attention precisely because of how well documented and how difficult to conventionally explain it has remained across the nearly 5 decades since the encounter itself. Parviz Jafari himself went on to a lengthy subsequent career within the Iranian military and later relocated to the United States, where he gave a series of detailed interviews decades after the encounter, including formal recorded testimony for a 2007 Sci-Fi Channel documentary and later statements to independent UAP researchers, in which he consistently affirmed the core details recorded in the original declassified report and specifically stated that in his own extensive professional assessment as a career fighter pilot, no conventional aircraft or natural phenomenon he was aware of could account for what he personally witnessed and experienced that night, testimony from the case's own primary witness that has remained across more than 4 decades of subsequent retelling, notably consistent with the earliest declassified documentation rather than drifting or expanding over time in the way some other decades-old testimony discussed across tonight's video arguably has. On the evening of March 13, 1997, thousands of people across a stretch of Arizona, spanning roughly 300 miles from the Nevada border through Phoenix and down toward Tucson, independently reported observing unusual lights in the night sky, in what remains, by a considerable margin, one of the most extensively witnessed mass UFO sightings in American history, generating a documentary record built not from a small number of trained military observers, as with several earlier cases discussed tonight, but from an unusually large number of ordinary civilian witnesses reporting broadly consistent observations across a wide geographic area within a compressed several-hour window. Witness accounts from that night generally describe 2 apparently distinct phases of activity, and researchers examining the full record have found it useful to treat them somewhat separately, given their different characteristics. The first phase, occurring in the early evening, involved numerous independent reports of a large V-shaped or boomerang-shaped formation of lights moving slowly and silently across the sky, described by many witnesses as appearing to be attached to a single enormous dark object rather than several separate independent lights traveling in loose formation. A specific structural detail repeated across a notably large number of independent witness accounts collected separately from each other in the immediate aftermath. Peter Davenport, director of the privately operated National UFO Reporting Center, which maintains a telephone hotline and public database for civilian UFO reports, and has operated continuously since 1974, later stated that his organization received several hundred individual calls specifically connected to the March 13 sightings. Within just the first few hours after the event, an unusually large and rapid volume of independent reports, converging on a single specific night that Davenport, drawing on more than 2 decades of experience logging civilian UFO reports by the time of the Phoenix event, described as among the most concentrated single-night reporting spike organization had ever recorded, a volume-based data point that, while not itself proof of any particular explanation, does provide independent quantitative corroboration for just how widely and immediately the sightings were noticed and reported across the affected region that night. Witness estimates of the first phase formation's physical scale varied considerably, a natural consequence of observers viewing the object from different distances and angles across a wide geographic area, but a notable number of independent accounts, gathered separately from each other in the days immediately following the event, described the object's apparent angular size as comparable to, in some specific witness comparisons, roughly the length of 1 to 2 football fields, held at arm's length against the night sky, an unusually large apparent size that, if the underlying distance estimates involved are even roughly accurate, would imply a physical structure considerably larger than any known conventional aircraft, a specific quantitative claim that has remained a central point of both interest and dispute among researchers attempting to reconstruct the object's true altitude, speed, and physical dimensions from witness testimony alone, absent any radar or photographic data comparable to what several other cases discussed tonight, including the Tehran and Nimitz encounters, were able to provide. The second phase, occurring several hours later that same night, involved a separate series of stationary, hovering lights observed over the Phoenix area specifically, a phase that has since been considerably more conclusively explained through documented military records. The U.S. Air Force's National Guard subsequently confirmed, through official records that have been publicly available and cross-referenced by independent researchers, that this second, later phase of stationary lights corresponded directly to a training exercise conducted that night by A-10 aircraft from the Maryland Air National Guard, deployed to the Barry Goldwater Range southwest of Phoenix, during which the aircraft dropped long-burning Lu-2BB illumination flares whose extended slow fall burn time and stationary appearance from a distance closely matches the second phase's specific witness descriptions, an explanation that has achieved broad, though not entirely universal acceptance among researchers examining the case, given the strength of the underlying documented military training records involved. The first phase, involving the earlier V-shaped or boomerang formation observed moving silently and slowly across a considerably wider stretch of the state, has not been resolved with anything approaching the same degree of documented confidence. And this distinction between the two phases is worth holding on to directly, since popular retellings of the Phoenix Lights case frequently blur them together in ways the underlying documentary record does not actually support. Proposed explanations for the first phase have included high-altitude aircraft flying in formation, viewed under specific atmospheric conditions that might have visually merged their individual lights into an apparent single connected shape, though several witnesses, including a number of trained pilots who happened to be among the observers that night, have specifically and consistently disputed this explanation, describing the object's apparent structure, scale, complete silence as inconsistent with formation aircraft as they understood the phenomenon from direct professional experience. Fife Symington, who served as Arizona's sitting governor at the time of the sighting, publicly acknowledged in 2007, roughly a decade after the event and following the end of his time in office, that he personally had witnessed the unexplained object that night, a genuinely notable piece of testimony, given that Symington had, at the actual time of the original event in 1997, participated in a now widely circulated press conference at which he had appeared to mock and dismiss public concern over the sightings, an episode Symington later explained as motivated by his desire, as sitting governor, to avoid contributing to public panic over an event. His own office had no clear conventional explanation for, at the time, a genuinely candid piece of retrospective testimony from a senior elected official that has added considerable additional public credibility to the case's overall documentary weight, even though, as with any personal recollection offered years after the fact, it should be weighed with the same general caution. This video has applied to comparable retrospective testimony throughout tonight's other chapters. The Phoenix Lights case remains, taken as a whole, a genuinely mixed evidentiary picture worth representing honestly and precisely, one clearly documented and well-explained phase tied directly to confirmed, records verified military flare drops, sitting alongside a separate, earlier phase involving a considerably larger number of independent civilian witnesses describing a structured, silent, slow-moving formation that has never achieved a comparably confident, conventional explanation, a combination that illustrates, as clearly as any single case discussed tonight, how a single widely reported UFO event can contain both a genuinely resolved component and a genuinely unresolved one simultaneously, requiring careful case-by-case analysis rather than a single blanket verdict applied to the entire evening's events at once. The Arizona Department of Public Safety and local police departments across the affected region received such a large volume of calls that night that several agencies later released their own dispatch logs in response to subsequent public records requests, providing an independent documentary trail entirely separate from Davenport's civilian hotline data and cross-referencing these two independent record sets, official police dispatch logs on one side and privately logged civilian hotline reports on the other, has allowed later researchers to establish a reasonably precise timeline of when and where the first phase sightings were reported across the state, a timeline broadly consistent with a single object, or tightly grouped formation of objects, moving on a generally consistent southeasterly trajectory across the reported window, rather than the scattered, unrelated individual sightings a purely coincidental mass misidentification event might be expected to produce. On November 14, 2004, pilots and radar operators aboard the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, conducting routine training exercises off the coast of Southern California, encountered an unidentified object that would become, roughly 13 years later, the single most consequential UFO case in modern American government history, specifically because of the unusually direct, official, and eventually publicly confirmed documentary trail it generated. The encounter began when radar operators aboard the USS Princeton, a guided missile cruiser operating alongside the Nimitz, detected an unusual, fast-moving radar contact that had reportedly been observed intermittently by the ship's advanced radar systems for roughly 2 weeks prior to the direct visual encounter, descending from an altitude of over 80,000 feet to near sea level. In a matter of seconds, a rate of descent radar operators considered inconsistent with any known aircraft. Commander David Fravor, leading a flight of 2 FCS-18 Super Hornet fighter jets dispatched to investigate, along with his weapons systems officer and the crew of a second aircraft, visually observed and closed to near direct proximity with a white oblong object roughly 40 feet in length, lacking any visible wings, engines, exhaust plume, or other conventional propulsion features. An object Fravor later publicly described in testimony and interviews given years afterward once the case became public as resembling an elongated Tic Tac breath mint, a description that gave the case its enduring popular nickname. Fravor's flight that day included a second aircraft crewed by Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, who independently corroborated the core details of the encounter in her own later public statements and formal testimony, notably maintaining a considerably more reserved public posture than Fravor across the years following the case's disclosure, generally declining to speculate about the object's origin, while consistently affirming that its observed flight characteristics fell outside anything she could explain using her own extensive naval aviation training. An independent corroborating account from a second, separately interviewed crew member that has added meaningful additional weight to the case's overall evidentiary record. Fravor and his squadron mates reported that the object appeared to react directly and immediately to their approach, at one point ascending and mirroring Fravor's own aircraft's flight path in a manner he described as behaving almost as though it were aware of and responding specifically to his presence, before rapidly accelerating away at a rate and in a manner Fravor, an experienced Navy fighter pilot, stated in subsequent testimony he could not account for using any conventional aircraft or physical principle familiar to him from his extensive professional flying experience. A second FC-18, flown by pilots Chad Underwood and callsign Slick, was subsequently vectored toward the same area specifically to capture instrumentation data using the aircraft's advanced targeting pod, successfully recording the infrared footage that would, more than a decade later, become the video publicly known as FLIR 1, one of 3 now officially confirmed U.S. Navy UAP videos. Underwood himself gave detailed public interviews years later describing the difficulty of the actual intercept attempt, stating that despite his aircraft's advanced targeting systems, he struggled to keep his sensor pod locked onto the object as it moved, and that the object's recorded acceleration away from his aircraft, once the object seemed to detect his approach, happened fast enough that he initially assumed his equipment had simply lost track of the target entirely, only reviewing the footage afterward to confirm the object had genuinely and rapidly departed the frame rather than his own sensor malfunctioning, a detail that adds useful first-person technical texture to the same encounter the released FLIR 1 footage itself documents. The case remained almost entirely outside public awareness for roughly 13 years following the original 2004 encounter, until December 16, 2017, when the New York Times, in a jointly reported story with Politico, published a major investigative article revealing the existence of a previously secret Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, commonly abbreviated AATIP, which had, among its other activities, formally investigated the 2004 Nimitz Encounter as part of a broader review of military UAP reports. The same article included the first public release of the FLIR 1 video footage, along with a second video, known as Go Fast, recorded during a separate 2015 encounter involving Navy pilots off the East Coast, both videos having been formally provided to the reporting team with Pentagon cooperation rather than leaked without authorization, a distinction that itself represented a genuinely significant shift in official government posture toward public UAP disclosure compared to the decades of institutional reticence that had generally characterized the post-Blue Book era. The U.S. Navy took the historically unusual step of formally confirming the authenticity of these released videos in a public statement issued in September 2019, explicitly acknowledging that the objects depicted remained officially identified, and this formal confirmation was extended further in April 2020, when the Department of Defense formally and officially released all three of the videos that by then entered public circulation: FLIR 1, Go Fast, and a third video known as Gimbal, through official Pentagon channels, explicitly stating the release was intended to clear up any public confusion regarding the video's authenticity, since unauthorized, lower-quality versions had already been circulating online for years, following the original 2017 New York Times reporting. The two additional videos released alongside FLIR 1 document genuinely separate encounters worth distinguishing individually rather than treating as an undifferentiated group. Gimbal, recorded during a January 2015 training exercise off the east coast of the United States by Navy FC-18 pilots, shows an oblong object rotating against the surrounding cloud layer as it appears to fly directly into strong headwinds without any visible loss of speed, prompting one of the recorded pilots to be heard on the audio track, exclaiming that the object was rotating, a specific behavior that has drawn particular analytical attention because it appears inconsistent with a stationary object simply being passed by the recording aircraft. Though some skeptical, analysts have separately proposed that the apparent rotation and wind-defying motion could result from an optical parallax effect produced by the targeting pod's own internal tracking gimbal. A technical explanation the object's popular nickname directly references. Go Fast, recorded the same month during a separate encounter, shows a small object skimming low and apparently fast over open ocean water, and while Navy pilots involved described the object as moving at extremely high speed based on its behavior relative to the water's surface below, a subsequent independent analysis published by physicist Mick West in 2019, drawing on the raw targeting pod telemetry data included in the released footage itself, argued the object's true speed and altitude, once properly calculated using that telemetry rather than relying on the pilot's in-the-moment visual impression alone, were considerably more modest and broadly consistent with a small aircraft or balloon moving at ordinary wind speed, an analysis that has itself become a frequently cited and actively debated counterpoint within the broader public discussion of the case. The Nimitz case's evidentiary weight, taken as a complete package, rests on a combination of factors genuinely unmatched by any single case examined earlier in tonight's video. Multiple independent radar systems aboard separate naval vessels, direct visual confirmation from multiple trained, experienced military pilots operating in immediate proximity to the object, officially captured and later officially released sensor footage, and perhaps most significantly of all, full and explicit Pentagon confirmation of the case's basic facts and the footage's authenticity, delivered not through an anonymous leak or a decades-old declassified file, as with most of tonight's earlier chapters, but through direct, on-the-record, contemporary official statements from the Department of Defense itself, a combination that transformed the entire subject of government UAP investigation from a topic largely relegated to Cold War-era historical archives into a live, actively developing area of official U.S. government interest and formal institutional response, setting the stage directly for the considerably larger and more formally structured government programs we'll examine across the remainder of tonight's video. The Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, first publicly revealed through the December 2017 New York Times reporting discussed in the previous chapter, had actually operated in considerably more limited public awareness for roughly 5 years before its existence became widely known, formally established within the Department of Defense in 2007, with an initial funding allocation of approximately $22 million, according to Pentagon budget documents subsequently confirmed through official government channels once the program's existence became public. The program's origins trace directly to the advocacy of then-Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, who, according to his own later public statements and interviews given after the program became public knowledge, had grown personally interested in the subject partly through conversations with Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas-based aerospace entrepreneur and hotel chain founder who had, separately from any government involvement, maintained a long-standing personal and financial interest in UFO research through his privately funded National Institute for Discovery Science. Reed, working alongside fellow senators Ted Stevens and Daniel Inouye, both of whom shared a documented, if less publicly discussed, personal interest in the subject, successfully secured the initial congressional funding that established AATIP within the Pentagon's existing intelligence infrastructure, with day-to-day program management contracted out substantially to Bigelow's own aerospace company, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, an unusually direct role for a private contractor to play within a formally government-funded defense intelligence program, and one that has itself drawn continued scrutiny and questions from researchers and journalists examining the program's full funding and management structure in the years since its existence became public. Luis Elizondo, intelligence officer who has publicly identified himself as having directed AAT during a portion of its operational history, became one of the most publicly visible figures connected to the modern UAP disclosure movement following his resignation from the Department of Defense in October 2017, submitting a formal resignation letter, later made public, in which he specifically criticized what he characterized as excessive institutional secrecy and insufficient senior-level attention being devoted to the program's findings within the broader Pentagon bureaucracy. Elizondo's public advocacy following his departure, including numerous television interviews, documentary appearances, and eventually formal congressional testimony discussed in the following chapter, played a genuinely significant and well-documented role in bringing the modern UAP subject to broad mainstream public and media attention, though it's worth noting directly that some aspects of Elizondo's specific institutional role and formal title within AATIP have themselves become a subject of some dispute and clarification in subsequent Pentagon statements and later official government reviews, a genuinely contested detail within an otherwise well-documented broader institutional history. Christopher Mellon, who had previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence during the Clinton administration, played a separate but closely connected role in bringing ATP's existence and the Nimitz footage to public attention, working directly with Elizondo and with the founders of To the Stars Academy, a private research and media venture established in 2017 by former Blink-182 musician and longtime UFO researcher Tom DeLonge, specifically to pursue continued UAP research and disclosure outside conventional government or academic channels. Mellon's own established credibility within mainstream defense and intelligence policy circles, considerably more conventional than DeLonge's own public background, lent the broader 2017 disclosure effort a degree of institutional seriousness within Washington policy circles that proved genuinely significant in the months following the initial New York Times reporting, helping translate what might otherwise have remained a niche media story into the sustained congressional and Pentagon institutional attention that would, within a few subsequent years, produce the Navy's formal video confirmations, the UAP Task Force, and eventually AARO its research papers examining an unusually wide range of subjects, some directly related to conventional aerospace threat analysis, and others considerably more speculative in scope, including papers examining historical accounts of unusual phenomena, and, according to several individuals who have described the program's internal work in subsequent interviews, some material addressing subjects well outside what most observers would consider conventional aerospace threat analysis in any narrow sense, a breadth of scope that has itself become a point of both criticism and, among some UAP researchers, particular ongoing interest regarding what the full body of OXAP-funded research may have ultimately contained. Robert Bigelow's own separate, privately funded research interests extended well beyond his government contracting work, most notably including his 1996 purchase of a Utah cattle ranch, subsequently and popularly nicknamed Skinwalker Ranch, where his privately funded National Institute for Discovery Science conducted years of independent investigation into a wide range of reported anomalous phenomena on the property, an investigation entirely separate from, though occasionally referenced in connection with, his later formal government AATIP and AAWSAP work. It's worth being precise about this distinction, since popular media coverage frequently blurs the two together, Skinwalker Ranch's specific claimed phenomena, and it's worth being precise about this distinction, since popular media coverage frequently blurs the two together. Bigelow Aerospace's broader corporate history is worth understanding briefly for context, since it helps explain how a private hotel and real estate entrepreneur came to occupy such a central role in formal government UAP research funding. Bigelow founded Bigelow Aerospace in 1999 as a genuinely separate commercial venture focused on developing expandable, inflatable space habitat modules, technology the company successfully licensed to NASA, resulting in the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module, a working habitat successfully attached to and tested aboard the International Space Station, beginning in 2016. An entirely conventional and independently verifiable aerospace engineering achievement that gave Bigelow genuine, well-documented standing within the mainstream aerospace industry well before and entirely separate from his later, more speculative personal interest in funding UAP-related research through his adjacent companies, a legitimate aerospace engineering track record that lends at least some additional institutional credibility to his subsequent government contracting relationship, even as his separate personal UAP interests, including Skinwalker Ranch, remain considerably more speculative and less independently verified. Following AATIP's formal conclusion as a distinctly named program around 2012, according to Pentagon officials' later public statements, elements of its work and mission were absorbed into subsequent, differently structured Department of Defense efforts, reflecting a broader institutional pattern visible throughout the government's UAP investigation history, dating back to the Project Sign, Grudge, and Blue Book transitions discussed in earlier chapters, in which formal government interest in the subject has rarely disappeared entirely, but has instead repeatedly reorganized itself under new program names, new funding structures, and new institutional homes within the broader defense and intelligence bureaucracy, a pattern of institutional continuity operating beneath frequently changing formal program identities that researchers studying the full declassified history of American government UFO investigation have specifically identified as one of the subject's most consistent and best documented structural features across its entire 75-year formal history. The direct institutional successor to this lineage of programs, the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, was formally established within the Department of the Navy in August 2020, explicitly building on and consolidating the earlier work of AATIP and related efforts, and this task force was itself superseded in July 2022 by the establishment of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, commonly abbreviated AARO, a considerably more formally structured and more extensively funded Pentagon office specifically tasked with coordinating and standardizing UAP investigation and reporting across every branch of the U.S. military and intelligence community simultaneously, representing, at the time of its establishment, the most formally organized and most extensively resource dedicated government UAP investigation effort in American history since Project Blue Book's closure 53 years earlier, an office whose formally published findings, released in a series of detailed reports beginning in 2023, form the subject of two of tonight's remaining chapters. On July 26, 2023, the House Oversight Committee's National Security Subcommittee convened a formal public congressional hearing specifically dedicated to UAP disclosure, representing the first open, televised congressional hearing on the subject in more than 5 decades. Since UFO-related congressional hearings held during the later years of Project Blue Book's operation in the late 1960s and generating what became, by a considerable margin, the most widely publicized and most consequential single UFO-related government event in decades, driven substantially by the formal, sworn testimony of one specific witness whose claims considerably further than anything discussed at any earlier hearing on this subject. A separate and somewhat less publicized hearing had already established meaningful precedent roughly 14 months earlier. On May 17, 2022, the House Intelligence Committee's Counterterrorism Subcommittee held a public hearing at which Scott Bray, then serving as the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence, formally briefed Congress on the state of UAP reporting, publicly stating that the number of reported incidents had grown substantially in recent years, attributing much of that growth to a formal, standardized reporting mechanism the Navy had specifically established to encourage pilots to report encounters without fear of professional stigma, a mechanism that had itself been largely absent during earlier decades, when many military aviators reportedly declined to file reports at all, out of concern the reports might affect their careers, a cultural and institutional barrier. Several pilots, including Ryan Graves, would later specifically identify in their own testimony as a significant and long underappreciated factor limiting the completeness of the government's historical UAP data. David Grush, a former Air Force intelligence officer who had previously served within the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and had, according to his own testimony, served as a representative to AARO's predecessor task force before formally filing a whistleblower complaint through official government channels, testified under oath that the United States government, in his understanding and based on interviews he stated he had personally conducted with more than 40 current and former government officials during his own formal investigative work, possessed and was maintaining a covert program involving the recovery of non-human craft and, according to his testimony, biological material associated with them. Testimony he delivered as a formal, sworn statement to Congress, carrying the same legal weight and potential perjury consequences as any other sworn congressional testimony. It's essential to state directly and precisely what Grush's testimony did and did not include, since public discussion of the hearing has frequently blurred this distinction in ways the actual congressional record does not support. Grush testified that he personally had not directly witnessed the alleged recovered craft or biological material himself, and explicitly stated under direct questioning that his claims were based on interviews he had conducted with other individuals during his own formal investigative work rather than on personal first-hand observation, and further stated that he could not discuss the most specific details of his claims, including which particular programs or locations were allegedly involved. In an open, unclassified public hearing setting, testimony he indicated he had already provided, or intended to provide, through appropriate classified channels to relevant congressional oversight committees, with the necessary security clearances to receive it. The Pentagon's formal, on-the-record response to Grush's specific claims, delivered both before and after the July 2023 hearing through official Department of Defense spokespersons, was direct and unambiguous. Officials stated that AARO had, as of that point in its ongoing investigation, found no verifiable evidence to substantiate claims of alien spacecraft recovery or reverse engineering programs of the kind Grush's testimony described a formal institutional denial that set up a direct and, as of the time of the hearing itself, genuinely unresolved evidentiary conflict between a sworn congressional whistleblower's formal testimony on one side and the Pentagon's own official on the record institutional position on the other. A conflict tonight's next chapter will examine in considerably more detail through AARO's own subsequent formal published findings. 2 additional witnesses testified alongside Grush at the same July 2023 hearing, providing testimony considerably more restrained in its specific claims but broadly consistent in tone regarding institutional secrecy concerns. Commander David Fravor, the same Navy pilot who personally led the 2004 Nimitz Tic Tac encounter discussed earlier in tonight's video, testified regarding his own direct first-hand experience, offering considerably more conservative characterization of what he had personally witnessed compared to Grush's second-hand claims, explicitly declining to speculate regarding the object's ultimate origin, beyond stating plainly that it demonstrated flight characteristics he could not explain using any conventional aircraft technology familiar to him. Ryan Graves, a former Navy pilot who has separately testified regarding numerous UAP encounters reported by military aviators during routine training operations along the U.S. East Coast, testified regarding the practical aviation safety concerns these frequent unexplained encounters raise for active-duty military pilots, framing his testimony considerably more around flight safety policy implications than around any speculation regarding the object's ultimate origin or nature. The hearing itself drew a notably large media and public turnout for a subcommittee session on a subject that, for most of the preceding half-century, had generally struggled to attract this level of sustained mainstream institutional attention, with C-SPAN's live broadcast and subsequent online clips of Grush's testimony accumulating tens of millions of views across various platforms within the following weeks, and multiple sitting members of Congress from both major parties publicly describing the testimony afterward as warranting serious, continued formal follow-up rather than dismissal, a bipartisan reaction that stood in fairly notable contrast to the more uniformly skeptical institutional posture that had generally characterized official Washington's public treatment of the subject during most of the preceding Blue Book and post-Blue Book decades discussed throughout tonight's earlier chapters. The July 2023 hearing generated substantial and immediate bipartisan congressional interest in continued UAP oversight, reflected directly in subsequent formal legislative action. Congress included provisions specifically addressing UAP records disclosure and government transparency within the National Defense Authorization Act passed later that same year, provisions that, notably, fell considerably short of the more sweeping disclosure requirements some congressional sponsors, including Senator Chuck Schumer, had initially proposed, following what several senators publicly described afterward as significant pushback from within the Pentagon broader intelligence community regarding the scope and pace of any mandated public disclosure, a legislative negotiation and its ultimate somewhat narrower outcome that itself became a subject of considerable follow-up reporting and continued congressional attention well into the following year, setting the direct institutional stage for the comprehensive Pentagon report examined in tonight's Nexus chapter. Senator Schumer's original 2023 proposal, formally titled the UAP Disclosure Act and introduced alongside Republican Senator Mike Rounds in a notably bipartisan pairing, would have established a formal legal presumption of immediate declassification for government. UAP records, modeled explicitly and directly on the disclosure framework Congress had earlier established for records related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, along with creating a 9-member independent review board specifically empowered to compel document release from any federal agency. The version that ultimately passed as part of the broader annual defense authorization legislation retained a considerably narrower records collection and reporting requirement, while dropping the presumption of automatic declassification and the Independent Review Board's compulsory authority, a substantial legislative retreat from the original proposal that Schumer himself, along with several other sponsoring senators, publicly and specifically attributed to concerted opposition from within the Pentagon and the broader intelligence community. During the bill's negotiation, opposition several sponsoring senators characterized in floor statements and subsequent interviews as reflecting institutional resistance to genuinely binding transparency requirements considerably more concrete than the general, often vaguely stated bureaucratic caution that had characterized government UFO policy since the earliest days of Project Sign. In response to the mounting congressional and public pressure generated by the events described in the previous chapter, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office undertook and formally published, in 2 parts released in March and December 2024, the most comprehensive historical review of American government UFO investigation ever conducted and made public by any single U.S. government agency, examining declassified and previously classified records spanning the entire period from 1945 through 2023, a review explicitly commissioned to directly address, among its other goals, the specific historical claims regarding recovered extraterrestrial craft and reverse engineering programs that had featured so prominently in David Grush's July 2023 congressional testimony. AARO's report reached a direct and unambiguous central conclusion regarding these specific historical claims. After examining formerly and currently classified records, conducting interviews with current and former government officials, including, according to the report's own stated methodology, individuals specifically identified by name in connection with the recovered craft claims circulating within UAP research and whistleblower communities, AARO stated it had found no verifiable evidence that the United States government or any private American company on its behalf had ever possessed, recovered, or reverse-engineered extraterrestrial technology or non-human biological material, a formal on-the-record institutional conclusion, directly and explicitly contradicting the substance of Grush's sworn congressional testimony from the previous year. The report went further than simply issuing a general denial, and instead devoted considerable specific attention to tracing the documented origin of several individual claims that had circulated for years within UAP research circles regarding alleged secret recovery and reverse engineering programs, identifying, in multiple specific documented instances, what the report's authors described as a pattern in which genuine, real, but entirely unrelated and unclassified historical events, information, or even outright works of fiction had, over years or decades of informal retelling, within a relatively small and interconnected community of researchers and government contractors, become progressively conflated, embellished, and eventually presented as evidence for a coordinated secret program, without, according to AARO's stated investigative findings, any underlying authentic classified program of the kind actually existing to connect them. One specific and widely reported example detailed within the report involved claims that a task force reporting structure some UAP program personnel had informally referred to using casual internal nicknames had subsequently been misinterpreted or mischaracterized by individuals working from incomplete second-hand information as evidence of a formally separate, deeply hidden institutional program, distinct from AARO's own publicly acknowledged work, a specific documented case study. The report offered as a direct illustration of precisely the kind of internal miscommunication and second-hand information distortion its broader investigation had repeatedly encountered while tracing the origins of numerous separate claims examined across its full review, AARO's stated investigative methodology for the historical report involved conducting several hundred formal interviews with current and former government officials, contractors, and other individuals connected to the various claims. Under review, a scale of direct interview-based investigation, the office's own report described as unprecedented for any single government review of this general subject, and the office additionally stated it had reviewed access to relevant special access programs, the formal government classification category governing the most tightly restricted and compartmentalized national security information, specifically to determine whether any program matching the recovered craft claims actually existed within that highest classification tier, reporting that this review, conducted with what the office described as appropriate senior-level authorization to examine even the most restricted program records, likewise produced no verifiable evidence supporting the existence of such a program. AARO's separate annual reports, required by the same congressional legislation discussed in the previous chapter and issued each year since 2022, document a striking and consistent increase in the raw volume of reported cases compared to any prior era of American government UFO investigation, with the office's report covering the period from May 2023 through June 2024, alone documenting more than 750 new individual reports, a single-year total already surpassing well over half of Project Blue Book's entire 22-year historical caseload discussed earlier in tonight's video. AARO's own stated interim resolution rate across these newer cases broadly mirrors the historical pattern established by Blue Book, the French Guy Pan, and the other national programs discussed throughout tonight's video, with the substantial majority ultimately attributed to conventional causes, most commonly small commercial drones and balloons, whose proliferation in recent years the office has specifically identified as a significant new contributing factor to the overall rise in reported sightings, a genuinely modern addition to the conventional explanation category that simply did not exist during Blue Book's own operational decades. AARO also formally launched, in 2024, a dedicated public reporting portal allowing current and former government employees, contractors, and members of the public to submit UAP reports and, where relevant, historical information regarding past government involvement in the subject directly to the office through a secure, standardized online intake system, a considerably more accessible and more consistently structured public submission process than existed at any point during Blue Book's own operational history, when reports arrived through a genuinely inconsistent patchwork of phone calls, mailed letters, and informal referrals from local law enforcement or military units. The office's stated intention behind this modernized intake system, according to its own public statements, was specifically to reduce the kind of second-hand, informally circulated testimony discussed earlier in this chapter, testimony like the claims underlying much of the recovered craft allegations, by giving individuals with genuine first-hand knowledge a direct, formally documented, and appropriately classified channel through which to come forward, rather than relying on the considerably less reliable chain of informal conversation and second-hand retelling that AARO's own historical review specifically identified as the primary source of many of the claims it ultimately found unsubstantiated. It's important, in the interest of representing this material with the same careful balance this video has applied throughout, to note directly that AARO's conclusions, while representing the most comprehensive and most authoritative official government statement on this specific set of claims currently available, have not fully settled the underlying public and researcher debate, and several UAP researchers, along with Grush himself in subsequent public statements responding directly to the report's release, have specifically questioned whether an internal Pentagon office, itself embedded within the same broader defense and intelligence bureaucracy the alleged programs would themselves belong to, can be considered a genuinely independent and unbiased body to investigate claims regarding that same bureaucracy's own alleged deepest secrets, a structural conflict of interest concern that mirrors, in its basic underlying shape, similar independence concerns some critics had separately raised decades earlier regarding the Air Force's own self-investigation of the Roswell case, discussed in Chapter 2, and regarding the Condon Report's Air Force-funded structure, discussed in Chapter 5. Congress itself has taken at least partial steps to address this specific structural concern directly, establishing, through the same 2022 legislation that formally created AARO, a separate UAP records collection housed at the National Archives, modeled explicitly on the JFK Records Collection framework. Schumer's own later disclosure proposal would go on to reference, and requiring federal agencies to transfer relevant records to this independent archives-held collection, rather than leaving them solely within the custody of the same defense and intelligence agencies whose historical conduct is under examination. A structural safeguard intended specifically to ensure that at least some portion of the underlying record remains accessible for independent review, regardless of any individual agency's own institutional incentives, though the practical volume of material actually transferred into this collection and the pace at which it becomes available for public researcher access remains, as of the most recent published status updates, considerably slower and more limited than the collection's most enthusiastic congressional sponsors originally envisioned. The JFK Records collection this framework was explicitly modeled on offers a genuinely useful point of comparison for understanding both the promise and the practical limits of this kind of legislated disclosure mechanism. Established by Congress in 1992, following renewed public interest sparked by Oliver Stone's film JFK, that collection required the release of assassination-related government records within 25 years by 2017, with any continued withholding beyond that date requiring specific, individually justified presidential certification. Even with that considerably more binding 25-year hard deadline behind it, a mechanism the current UAP records collection notably lacks. Full release of the JFK-related material took years longer than originally planned, with additional documents continuing to be released in stages through 2022 and beyond, a track record worth keeping directly in mind as a realistic benchmark for how long the considerably newer and less strictly bound UAP records collection discussed above may actually take to reach anything resembling full public availability. Separately from its treatment of the recovered craft claims, specifically, AARO's report also formally addressed and, in several individual instances, offered updated conventional explanations for a number of the specific historical cases examined across tonight's earlier chapters, generally affirming or offering further supporting technical detail for conventional explanations, including temperature inversion radar artifacts for cases resembling the 1952 Washington Flyovers and misidentified classified aircraft testing for a considerable number of Cold War-era Blue Book cases, while notably declining to offer any specific alternative conventional explanation for a small number of individual cases, including elements of the Nimitz Encounter discussed earlier in tonight's video, which the report continued to formally list among a modest number of cases still lacking a fully confident conventional explanation as of its December 2024 publication date, maintaining, in this specific narrow respect, broadly consistent institutional position with Project Blue Book's own final 1969 tally of 701 formally unresolved cases discussed near the very beginning of tonight's video, a small residual category of genuine, officially acknowledged uncertainty that has persisted in some form across every formal phase of American government UFO investigation for more than 75 continuous years. The United States has never been the only government to formally investigate and, eventually, declassify files related to unidentified aerial phenomena, and several other nations maintain their own distinct, independently documented investigative histories worth understanding directly, both because they offer genuinely useful points of comparison to the American record covered across tonight's earlier chapters, and because several specific foreign case files rank among the most carefully documented and scientifically structured UFO investigations conducted anywhere in the world. France's Groupement d'études d'information sur les phénomènes aérospatiaux non identifiés, commonly abbreviated GPAN, traces its institutional origins to 1977 and operates today as a formally chartered unit within the French National Center for Space Studies, France's national space agency, giving it a distinctive institutional home directly within a civilian scientific agency rather than embedded within a military intelligence structure, as has generally been the case throughout most of the American program's history. GPAN maintains a publicly searchable database, freely accessible online, cataloging tens of thousands of individual French UFO reports collected since the agency's founding, sorted using a formal 4-tier classification system, ranging from cases fully explained through conventional means to cases the agency's own trained investigators classify as involving genuinely strong, well-documented evidence that nonetheless resists any conventional explanation currently available. A formal, publicly transparent classification methodology, considerably more openly documented and more consistently applied across its full multi-decade case history than the equivalent American Blue Book system ever achieved during its own comparable operational period. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense maintained its own formal UFO investigation desk, generally staffed by a small team working within the broader defense intelligence apparatus, continuously from the 1950s until the program's formal closure in December 2009, a closure the ministry explicitly justified in its own public statement at the time by noting that continued UFO investigation was not considered a valuable use of increasingly limited defense resources. Language and institutional reasoning genuinely similar in substance to the Condon Report's own core justification for Project Blue Book's American closure 4 decades earlier, following a sustained multi-year Freedom of Information campaign led primarily by British UFO researcher David Clarke, working in close collaboration with the National Archives. The Ministry of Defense formally released the complete surviving archive of its historical UFO case files in stages between 2008 and 2013, encompassing tens of thousands of individual pages spanning more than 5 decades of British government investigation, now permanently and freely available for public research access through the UK's National Archives. Belgium's government documented UFO history censuses specifically on an extended wave of sightings occurring between 1989 and 1990, widely known among researchers as the Belgian UFO wave, during which thousands of independent witnesses across the country reported observing large, silent, triangular objects with distinctive light patterns, a wave of sightings that reached its evidentiary peak on the night of March 30 and 31, 1990, when the Belgian Air Force formally scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets in response to persistent, unusual radar contacts, jets that achieved several brief radar lock-on attempts on the unidentified object before ultimately losing contact, according to the Belgian Air Force's own, subsequently declassified official case file, a formal military document that remains, among European declassified files specifically, one of the most extensively analyzed and most frequently cited in international UFO research literature, given the direct involvement of Belgium's own national air defense system and multiple simultaneous independently corroborating civilian and military witnesses across the same sustained multi-hour window. The former Soviet Union maintained its own parallel, independently documented history of military UFO investigation, considerably less publicly known in the West than the American program, but substantial in its own right. Conducted primarily through a KGB-affiliated initiative that internal Soviet documents referred to under the codename Setka, meaning grid or network in Russian, active from the mid-1970s through the Soviet collapse in 1991. Portions of this archive became available to Western researchers only after the Soviet Union's dissolution, through a combination of interviews with former Soviet military and intelligence officials willing to speak once the political pressure to maintain absolute secrecy had eased considerably, and a smaller number of formally released documents revealing a Soviet military investigative apparatus that had reached broadly similar conclusions to its American counterpart across a broadly similar case distribution. The large majority of reports explained conventionally. Alongside a comparable small residual percentage, the program's own internal assessments left formally unresolved, a genuinely striking point of convergence between two Cold War adversaries who otherwise shared remarkably little in the way of open scientific or intelligence cooperation during the same decades. New Zealand's Royal New Zealand Air Force maintains its own formally declassified case file, connected to a well-documented December 1978 sighting off the coast of Kaikoura on the country's South Island, during which a cargo plane crew and, separately, a television news team flying aboard. A second aircraft specifically dispatched to investigate captured radar contact and film footage of unusual lights maneuvering near their aircraft over roughly 90 minutes of intermittent observation, footage that received significant international broadcast coverage at the time. And that remains, according to the RNZAF's own formally released case documentation, among the best radar and visual corroborated civilian aviation UFO encounters in the entire Southern Hemisphere's declassified record. The New Zealand Defence Force's official assessment, consistent with a pattern by now familiar across nearly every case examined tonight, attributed the bulk of the sighting to a combination of the planet Venus, lights from local fishing boats reflecting off, low cloud, and a passing meteor, an explanation that has satisfied many researchers reviewing the case whilst leaving several specific individual radar contacts, according to the same official file, not fully and conclusively accounted for by any single proposed conventional cause. Chile stands out among South American nations for having established, in 1997, one of the most formally structured and scientifically rigorous government UFO investigation bodies operating anywhere in the world, the Comité de Estudios de Fenómenos Aéreos Anomalos, commonly abbreviated CIFA, which operates as a unit specifically embedded within the Chilean Directorate General of Civil Aeronautics, giving it direct institutional access to the country's actual civilian air traffic control and radar infrastructure for real-time case investigation, an operational integration considerably closer than most comparable programs elsewhere in the world achieve, and one CIFA's own leadership has specifically cited as central to the organization's ability to investigate reported cases using primary radar and pilot communication data gathered in genuinely close to real time, rather than relying primarily, as many historical Blue Book-era American cases were forced to, on witness testimony collected and formally documented only well after the fact. Peru's own Air Force established a broadly comparable institutional body, the Oficina de Investigación de Fenómenos Aéreos Anómalos, commonly abbreviated DIFA, in 2001, similarly embedded directly within the country's military aviation structure and granted comparable direct access to national radar and air traffic data, while Uruguay's Air Force has separately maintained its own dedicated investigative commission since 1989, one of the longest continuously operating government UFO investigation bodies anywhere in South America, publishing periodic public reports summarizing its formally investigated caseload using a classification framework broadly similar in structure to France's Gaipan system. Taken together, this cluster of South American national programs, considerably less internationally publicized than their American, British, or French counterparts, reflects a genuinely global pattern of formal government interest in the subject extending well beyond the small handful of countries whose specific files tend to dominate English-language popular discussion of declassified UFO history. Beyond these specific national programs, it's worth noting directly that the broader pattern visible across nearly every foreign government UFO investigation examined by researchers studying the international declassified record closely mirrors the pattern already well established across tonight's earlier American-focused chapters. The substantial majority of formally investigated cases in every national archive studied receive conventional explanations involving misidentified aircraft, astronomical objects, weather phenomena, or classified military technology unknown to observers at the time, while a small, generally consistent residual percentage, typically cited across multiple national programs as falling somewhere in a broad range from 3 to 10% of total formally investigated cases depending on the specific program's own classification standards, remains formally and officially unresolved. Even after dedicated, resourced government investigation, a strikingly consistent cross-national pattern that researchers studying the international comparative record have specifically identified as one of the most genuinely notable and best independently corroborated findings within the entire broader field of declassified government UFO investigation worldwide, a consistency spanning nations with otherwise wildly different political systems, intelligence traditions, and institutional relationships to their own militaries, from a NATO member state's Air Force in Belgium to a formerly communist superpower's own internal KGB archive, converging independently and without any apparent coordination between them on remarkably similar overall statistical conclusions. We've spent tonight moving slowly through more than 7 decades of declassified government files, from Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting and the retracted Roswell press release through the Washington Flyovers and the full 17-year run of Project Blue Book, past the Condon reports, contested closure of that program through Rendlesham, Tehran, and Phoenix, into the Nimitz Encounter that reopened formal government interest in the subject after a 4-decade institutional gap through AATIP, the 2023 Congressional Hearings, and AARO's own comprehensive historical review, and finally out across the parallel, independently documented investigative histories of France, Britain, Belgium, and Chile. It seems fitting to close by sitting honestly with what this entire accumulated body of declassified material actually, carefully, shows as distinct from what popular imagination and decades of dramatized retelling have sometimes layered on top of it. The single most consistent, best documented, and most cross-nationally corroborated finding across every government program examined tonight is this: the overwhelming majority of formally investigated UFO reports, generally, cited in the range of 90 to 95%, depending on the specific program and its classification standards, receive conventional explanations upon careful investigation involving misidentified conventional or classified aircraft, astronomical objects, weather phenomena including temperature inversions and ball lightning, deliberate hoaxes, and simple, honest human misperception of ordinary phenomena under unusual viewing conditions, a finding remarkably consistent across programs as institutionally and geographically distinct as the American Blue Book, the French Gaipan, and the British Ministry of Defence's own independent archive, a smaller but genuinely and consistently persistent residual category, generally falling somewhere between 3 and 10% of formally investigated cases across nearly every national program studied, remains officially and formally unresolved even after dedicated, resourced government investigation using each program's own best available conventional explanatory tools. a category that includes several of the specific, carefully documented cases we've examined closely tonight. The Lonnie Zamora encounter, the Tehran Incident's correlated avionics failures, elements of the Nimitz Tic Tac encounter, and the Belgian F-16 radar contacts among them. It's worth stating this distinction as precisely and as carefully as possible, since it sits at the very heart of everything this video has tried to represent accurately. Unresolved and unexplained by conventional means currently available to investigators is not the same claim as confirmed extraterrestrial, and no government program examined across tonight's entire 14 chapters, including AARO's own most recent and most comprehensive 2024 review, has ever formally reached that considerably stronger conclusion for any single case in its own declassified historical record. What has genuinely and measurably changed, particularly across the years since the Nimitz case became public, in 2017, is the American government's institutional posture toward public disclosure and formal acknowledgement of this small, residual, unresolved category, shifting from Project Blue Book's often defensive, minimization-oriented public relations approach during the 1950s and 1960s toward AARO's considerably more transparent, if still genuinely incomplete and still actively contested modern reporting framework, a shift reflected directly in concrete, verifiable institutional actions, official Pentagon confirmation of genuine sensor footage, formal congressional testimony delivered under oath, and comprehensive, publicly released historical reports explicitly naming and directly addressing even the most extraordinary claims circulating within the broader public conversation, rather than simply declining to engage with them at all, as earlier eras of government UFO policy had generally, if not always, preferred to do. There remains, and this video has tried throughout to represent honestly, rather than resolve artificially, genuine and unresolved tension between institutional accounts and individual testimony that the broader public record has not yet, and perhaps cannot yet, fully settle. David Grush's sworn congressional claims sit directly alongside IRO's own formal, on-the-record denial, and Charles Holt's continued personal skepticism toward the Rendlesham Lighthouse explanation sits directly alongside the Ministry of Defense's own more cautious, formally unresolved institutional verdict on that same case. These are not contradictions. This video is positioned to resolve definitively, and it would be a disservice to the actual documented record and to the genuine complexity it reflects to pretend otherwise simply for the sake of a tidier closing chapter. It's worth remembering, too, just how much of what we've covered tonight was, for years or decades, genuinely difficult for an ordinary member of the public to access at all, sitting in file boxes, microfilm reels, and classified vaults before a specific researcher, journalist, or formal FOIA request finally brought it into daylight. David Clarke's decade-long campaign that ultimately pried loose the full British Ministry of Defense archive, the New York Times reporting team that spent months quietly verifying the Nimitz footage and AATIP's very existence before publishing a single word, the individual FOIA requesters, largely anonymous and mostly unthanked, whose patient, repeated, procedurally unglamorous paperwork accounts for a genuinely enormous share of everything examined across tonight's 14 chapters. The gap between a real government record and public knowledge of it is very rarely closed by dramatic revelation. It's closed, far more often, exactly the way it was closed again and again tonight, slowly, procedurally, one properly filed request at a time. What can be said with real confidence resting directly on the fully declassified paper trail examined across all 300 case references woven through tonight's 14 chapters is this: governments around the world have taken the subject of unidentified aerial phenomena seriously enough, across more than 7 decades and across at least 5 separate national programs, to formally investigate, document, and eventually declassify an enormous and still growing body of material material that reveals an institutional history considerably more careful, more genuinely uncertain in its small residual margins, and more honestly self-critical at points than either the most dismissive skeptics or the most confident believers, working from popular retellings alone rather than the underlying documents themselves typically assume going in. It's worth naming, too, just how much of tonight's material spans an unusually wide range of institutional character, from a small-town Texas Sheriff's Department in 1957 to a Utah cattle ranch bought by a Las Vegas hotel developer, to a sworn statement delivered under oath before the United States Congress, to a KGB archive that stayed sealed for decades behind an entirely separate government's own wall of Cold War secrecy. Very few subjects in modern history connect a rural New Mexico ranch foreman, a Belgian F-16 pilot, a Chilean civil aviation official, and a Navy commander flying off the coast of California under one single continuous 77-year documentary thread, and that sheer institutional and geographic breadth is, on its own, part of why the subject has proven so durable and so difficult for any single government in any single country to either fully explain or fully close. That honest, carefully bounded uncertainty, sitting quietly at the edge of an otherwise mostly explained body of evidence, is not really an unsettling place to end a long night's listening. It's closer to the opposite. 77 years after Kenneth Arnold's sighting near Mount Rainier, the file is still, technically and officially, open. A small number of genuinely puzzling cases still sitting exactly where Project Blue Book, and now AARO after it, formally left them. Unresolved, carefully documented, and quietly waiting, the same way any properly kept government archive waits, for whichever future investigator eventually has the time, the tools, and the patience to look at them clearly one more time. You don't have to resolve any of it tonight. You just have to let the quiet weight of all those case files settle over you, the radar logs and the sworn testimony, and the 77 years of careful, patient paperwork, the balloons and the flares and the small residual handful that never quite resolved, and let that same unhurried, unresolved stillness carry you, just as gently, page after page, file after file, all the way down into sleep.